Hi, I'm Joseph Wronka. I would first like to thank all the School of Social Work, Roshni Nalaya, Bangalore, hope I pronounced that right, and the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bangalore, for organizing the conference, and more specifically, Drs. Ramelia Shekhar and Shailaja Santosh for their individual assistance. It is with much regret that I was unable to attend, but hopefully this video will be an effective opportunity to share my ideas with you for robust debate. For I am a strong believer that ultimately we must debate the issues and come to our own conclusions because only chosen values endure. Let me first give a little history of the importance of the idea of human rights that today no government would dare say they are against. Eleanor Roosevelt, well, she was an American. She was chair of the drafting committee for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, always said that ideas move people. So the idea of human rights moves people. If I say healthcare is a human right, it moves you, in my view, a lot more than saying it's socially just to have healthcare. Where did this human rights come about? Well, in 1938, there was a conference at Evian to stop the abuses of Adolf Hitler. Here I go again. Now, it was also called by the United States, but only after much pressure from religious groups who put the pressure on President Roosevelt. There was tremendous government hypocrisy at the conference. The German representative was there, and he basically told the United States, well, if you want us to stop with these concentration camps, you are going to stop your public lynchings. And they told Russia, you also have a gulag. And they told other European countries, you have torture. Well, France had torture in Algeria. So what happened was the horrors of World War II. An estimated 92 million were killed, 10 million in the camps, predominantly Jews, but also 1/4 of Poland, gypsies. It was absolutely horrendous. So in order for this not to happen again, the United Nations was formed in 1945, and they set up a drafting committee to come up with a document that all countries would agree. And they eventually came up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There were such horrors during World War II that nowadays no government would dare say that they are against human rights. The helping and health professions, the International Federation of Social Work, and the American Psychological Association, the American Nurses Association, the American Public Health Association, and you're going to have to do your homework with India, have basically said in their documents that human rights is important. I mentioned the International Federation of Social Work, and they said that from its inception, social work has been a human rights profession. The American Public Health Association has also said that human rights should provide the ethical foundation of which all public health practice comes from. The issue, however, is what exactly is human rights? People tend to equate human rights with political imprisonment, doing away with the death penalty, doing away with torture. Of course, these are very important issues. But I think if we are to understand human rights, we have to understand what's referred to as the human rights triptych. At the center of the triptych is what is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which former Pope John Paul II, now he's referred to as St. John Paul the Great, said was a milestone in the long and difficult struggle of the human race. What does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights consist of? It consists of 5 crucial notions. Article 1 says everyone has a right to human dignity. Now, human dignity should be at the basis of all policies. Well, I don't really know how it is in India, but in the United States, if you have a woman on welfare, she has to wait for 4 hours to get benefits. It's hardly dignified. We have to move towards a culture of dignity. And this is also a culture of human rights that I mentioned in the introduction, that must be a lived awareness of these principles in our minds and our hearts and dragged into our everyday life. So the first crucial notion is human dignity. The second crucial notion is Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that we should not discriminate against each other. We should not discriminate on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of national origin, on the basis of religion, basically any other status or accidental attribute that digresses from being human. The only criteria to have human rights is that you're human, and the rights should not be given to special groups based on their race, their ethnicity, and their national origin. That is definitely a challenge. The third crucial notion is what is known as civil and political rights. This crucial notion has to do with freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. They are also referred to as negative rights, whereas the government just has to lay off. You can say what you want, you can criticize what you want, and government must lay off. The fourth crucial notion is known as economic, social, and cultural rights. These rights are also referred to as positive rights. They consist of the rights to health care, the rights to security in old age, the rights of children, the rights of families, the right to employment, the right to rest and leisure, and the right to education. And here, they're also referred to as positive rights, where government must have a hands-on approach, and they must do something to make sure that these rights are guaranteed. Now, the fifth crucial notion of a socially just international order, basically is in Articles 28 to Articles 30. This basically says that every right has a corresponding duty, and also every person on this planet has a right to have their government to cooperate with other governments. What I'm trying to say is we cannot solve such problems as war if governments do not cooperate, as climate change if governments do not cooperate, as a clean environment if governments do not cooperate, the right to self-determination if governments do not cooperate, and that every right has a corresponding duty. Now, I do know that the Indian Constitution is filled with duties, and there's a lot to be said about every right having a corresponding duty. I know that your Gandhi, he was asked for his input into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Mahatma said, "When I think of human rights, I think of what my wise but illiterate mother told me, that we must do our duties as citizens to the world. So we have a duty not to litter, that would clean the environment up, and we also have a duty for our government to cooperate with other governments to work against climate change and things like that." And sadly, of course, as many of you know, we now have a president that doesn't believe it. Very sad. But on the right of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Human Rights Triptych, we have here 8 major human rights conventions, and they have to do with civil rights. The International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, they have to do with race. The Convention to Eradicate Racial Discrimination, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The CRC, which is the Convention on the Rights of Children. The CAT, the Convention on Torture. What's known as CESCAR, which is the Convention on Economic and Social Rights. The CRPD, the Convention on the Rights to People with Disabilities. And the CMW, the Convention on Migrant Workers. Now, this is the clincher. The United States has only ratified 3 of those conventions, okay? Now, let's go to the country of India. What have you ratified? You have ratified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I guess you're twice as with it when it comes to human rights conventions as we are. these conventions further reiterate what is said in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration says, for example, that families and children require special protections. Now, CEDAW, I mentioned the one on women, talks about what these special protections are. Basically, they'll say something like, if a woman wants to work in the formal marketplace, government must provide for good, adequate daycare. And if a woman is pregnant, before and after childbirth, she must be given reasonable compensation and get her job back so that she can raise the kid and the kid can bond, and also later on she can keep her job. The United States, for the most part, doesn't have this. We have government mandated roughly 10 to 12 weeks of time off from your job, but you don't get any money, so it's only for the rich, basically. I'm not sure what it is in India. Now, over on the left of the human rights triptych are the implementation measures. The implementation measures are really probably the weakest part of the human rights triptych. They consist of reports to conventions, monitoring committees. In other words, once you sign those conventions, you have to answer to a monitoring committee. They consist of thematic reports on, let's say, racism in a specific country or poverty in a specific country. It consists of the Universal Periodic Review, which every 4 years a country must submit to the Human Rights Council how it's doing on human rights, whether you are a signatory to those conventions or not. And then they also have special rapporteurs on climate change, violence against women, things like that. They have world conferences, as you know. They recently had the World Conference in Paris on climate change. And then they have follow-up conferences to the world conferences roughly every 5 years. There was a women's convention, women's world conference back in 1995, and every 5 years they had follow-up to basically see how countries are doing. Now, I can't get into everything in this talk, but let's talk about, let me just give by way of example some of these reports to the conventions. These are all on the internet, and by the way, you can go to my website, humanrightsculture.org. The United States, for example, submitted reports to the United Nations Human Rights Council, and the United Nations Human Rights Council brought up things to them like, well, first of all, they say good things. They enacted the Matthew Shepard Act, which basically forbids hate crimes against people of different sexual orientation. So they start off with good things, but then they also talk about police brutality. They'll talk about poverty in the United States. They'll talk about substandard housing for minority groups. And they will say things like they feel the United States should apologize to what they did to the people of Hawaii. And actually, the United States did apologize. Okay, so now let me pick on India for a little bit, if you don't mind. The Human Rights Committee, and by the way, these are all over the internet, told India that they have vast constitutional provisions to serve minorities and to help them. They have forbidden, actually, the caste system. They have forbidden untouchability. And I read your constitution in India. Actually, it's really great. I think it was Dr. Ambedkar that basically was responsible. Well, people were all responsible, but I know Dr. Ambedkar is referred to as the father of the Constitution. But it's a great constitution. But it said, despite these constitutional provisions, the Dalit, there is tremendous de facto, the fact is there's tremendous discrimination that exists against the Dalits, and They are just not really included. There is included in the community building as they should. There is violence against Dalit women. There is de facto segregation against Dalits in places of worship, hospitals, education, water, and they brought up things like child marriages and dowry. Every country has their problems, and my point is, if you're going to work with human rights, we all have to be humble. We need the spirit of Crazy Horse, which is peace, humility, and everlasting love. Human rights should be the foundation for social justice and has tremendous implications for public health. This diagram basically says that human rights is the foundation for social justice and should provide input into the various levels of intervention for public health. What are these levels? I refer to these levels as the meta-macro. Most people say go upstream and they only talk about the macro. I would like to talk about the meta-macro, which is a global approach which transcends take it for granted assumptions about entities like the nation state. Yes, the meta-macro, you know, they say go upstream, but streams are connected to the ocean and globally. I think ultimately we must all declare ourselves world citizens, and there should be an allegiance to humanity, to quote Joseph Rotblat, the Nobel Prize winner. One flag, one world. I know it's a little radical, but it has to be done non-violently. The macro deals with whole populations, as you know, and some examples are working for rights to shelter, for meaningful employment as amendments to the Constitution. The meso level deals with at-risk populations. Examples are employer protections, unions, and an assessment of people that are at risk for substance abuse or HIV. Each of these levels has their problems, of course. The micro level is basically deals with populations whose symptomatology is now fully blown, such as counseling the depressed person, the substance abuser, a person with AIDS, setting up a homeless shelter. Very briefly, the macro wants to prevent the homeless from coming. The micro, but the homeless are there, so you have to help them and build up the homeless shelter. But the macro, I would say the meta-macro, is to implement United Nations activities. So those are some examples. Now, also I must say in my book, and it's going to be on display somewhere, I have another bunch of examples where they talk about this. I have many examples how they relate to alcoholism, mental illness, AIDS, and obesity. Let me talk about mental illness. What would be a meta-macro intervention? A meta-macro intervention would be implementing the United Nations Charter, which is sort of the granddaddy or the grandmommy of all this. I didn't mention it before, but it's there. The United Nations Charter says everyone has a right to employment. We must implement the United Nations Charter. Look, when you're talking about mental illness, ultimately you're talking about suicide, okay? Very serious stuff. But suicide and depression, it is a symptom of hopelessness, no hope in the future. Now, if people had a job and paid meaningful wages and the job was socially useful and contributed to the development of the human personality, we'd be onto something. People would have hope. So we must implement the UN Charter. That's the meta-macro. Now look at the macro is basically teaching children to find viable ways to change their moods. And we get a lot of these ideas for interventions, in my view, from the human rights conventions. The rights of the child says if someone has been depressed or abused emotionally, sexually, physically, it is our responsibility to reintegrate them back into society. And therefore, we must have health care and we must have ways to do this. And this is where the helping professions come in. The meso level deals with at-risk people. And I always like to talk about most of the kids that get sent to the social worker or the psychologist tend to be disruptive children. But if you are going to help children. And if you're going to help do it right, you have to find kids that aren't disruptive, that go to school with a briefcase and glasses that are 6 inches thick, and they're just studying, they're all alone. We have to have an aggressive way to deal with these, to find these children who are at risk and work with them. It's not only the disruptive kids. On the micro level, we have to counsel kids that are to develop adequate coping strategies in group and or individual settings. Talk to them about what do you do if your alcoholic parent comes walking into the room. Make sure you're safe. Talk to your godmother, things like that. Now, look, with this human rights stuff, if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, you don't have to like push it. Some of this is common sense, but my feeling is that a lot of these approaches, okay, if you read these human rights instruments correct, they sort of emanate from that. Oh, by the way, there is also the meta micro. I didn't really mention that, but the meta micro is basically getting better, not necessarily through professional interventions, but by non-professional ones in the everyday life. I'm thinking of what the phenomenologist would talk about, the Lebensfeld, that the everyday life can help you. It may be seen as negating professionalism, but it's not. What do I mean by that? Supportive siblings. We have in the United States Alcoholics Anonymous, Emotions Anonymous. We have Depressions Anonymous, Love and Sex Addicts Anonymous. We have all these things, but people can get better by talking to each other. Now, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women spoke about the need for support groups for women in rural areas, and the United Nations, when I was on sabbatical last year, came up with a Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. And they're so far away from help, so to speak, that professionals have to go in there and they have to find ways to help one another. That's the meta micro. And yes, research. Okay, let's talk about research. Research basically looks at best practices and also bad practices. But we're talking about quantitative and qualitative research. We have to look at what works and what doesn't work, okay? And what people find is that in public health, let's say you want people to take their medication because they might be schizophrenic. I don't like that label, but you get my point. You might find out that what does work is when the prescriber is not authoritarian, doesn't say take this pill, take that pill, but incorporates the patient into treatment. And that's a fundamental, I've only mentioned 8 of the human rights documents, there are a whole bunch of others. It's fundamental to help people partake in treatment. There's a document on the protection of persons with mental illness. And if you talk to practitioners, what you might find out is that they didn't include the family in treatment, or that they didn't monitor the medications. Okay, so they're part of the treatment where they give their input, but they have to be monitored. Well, thank you. I think time's running out, but I just want to say this at the end. Things, of course, are really rather complicated. Whatever the human rights violation, say, for example, female genital mutilation, FGM, there must be no tolerance, of course. But still, we must be culturally sensitive and, in brief, not hypocritical. Because in the West, if you want a husband, you have to be dead from anorexia nervosa. Yes, that's a joke. I hope you will excuse the exaggeration. But like Pope Francis said once, who am I to judge? Who are we to judge? I'm against female genital mutilation, but we have to look at our own selves. And I want to say that a human rights violation does not justify military intervention. When the United States invaded Somalia back in 1993, right before, the newspapers were filled with stories of rampant FGM there. And I remember reading the New York Times, 95% of the women were generally mutilated. But it's to gain public consensus to invade that strategically located country where all the oil goes down. And we need to have a little bit more humility, less hypocrisy. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoy the conference. I'm there in spirit. Thank you very much. Take care.